Hello, welcome to Unit 4 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this unit. In this unit, we will be covering major developments in the 1960s. Specifically, we will be addressing the war in Vietnam, the Cultural Revolution, also known as the hippie movement, and changes to immigration law, which would have a huge impact on the future of America as well. In this unit, you are asked to complete 3 assignments. The first assignment involves participation in a discussion board. The discussion board question focuses on the origins of the war in Vietnam. Secondly, you will be asked to watch a video entitled Summer of Love, which is a historical documentary dealing with an aspect of the hippie counterculture. You'll be asked to write a review of that film. And finally, you'll be asked to read a feature essay entitled Unintended Consequences, The Second Great Migration, which deals with shifts in immigration law. I'd like to briefly comment upon each of these topics. The United States was directly involved in a war in Vietnam from 1964 to 1975. This was a devastating conflict in which approximately 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and several million people in Vietnam died. The origins of the war in Vietnam extend far back into history, far before 1964. So I'd like to comment on that a bit. Vietnam became a colony of France in the late 19th century. In the late 1800s, the Empire of France conquered and gained control of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. France referred to this territory as French Indochina. This was part of a much broader colonial movement. European powers conquered much of the territory of Asia during this period of time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Vietnam would be a colony of France from the 1880s up until 1940. So for a period of about 60 years, Vietnam was a colony of France. There emerged an independence movement within Vietnam. Many people in Vietnam resented and were hostile to French rule, not surprisingly perhaps. Now, there were people in Vietnam who supported French rule, especially merchants, the business class, wealthy landowners, primarily people living in urban areas, who benefited from French colonial rule and French trade. But it seems that a majority of the peasant population of poor farmers were opposed to French rule in Vietnam. In 1919, a young man from Vietnam named Ho Chi Minh, who was studying in France, attended the conference at Versailles in France. The conference at Versailles was a conference which was designed to reshape the world following the end of the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had argued for the principle of self-determination, that the peoples of Europe should be able to choose their own government. Ho Chi Minh, who was a very young man at this point, appeared at the conference and demanded that the people of Vietnam be granted self-determination, that the people of Vietnam have the right to choose and elect their own government. Of course, neither Woodrow Wilson nor any of the leaders of Europe had intended self-determination to apply to the colonial peoples of Africa and Asia. But Ho Chi Minh asserted that the people of Vietnam had a right to choose their own government. Ho Chi Minh's demand was not met. It really was never even seriously considered. Subsequently, Ho Chi Minh went to Soviet Russia. A communist revolution had just occurred in Russia. He traveled to Moscow, and Ho Chi Minh attended a school designed to train revolutionaries. By 1921, Ho Chi Minh had returned to Vietnam, and he founded the Communist Party of Vietnam, and began an insurrection, a rebellion against French rule. Now, at this point, the Vietnamese rebels had neither the weapons nor the power to directly confront the French on the battlefield, and therefore they resorted to what might be called guerrilla tactics or asymmetrical warfare. They would set up booby traps, launch ambushes in the jungles, and generally try to strike at French forces where they were weak, blow up rail lines, disrupt transportation, etc. This insurgency went on for decades. From 1921 to 1940, the Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh fought a guerrilla war against French forces, a reasonably low-level war. The situation changes in 1940. As part of the Second World War, the Empire of Japan invades and conquers Indochina. The Japanese Empire, the Japanese government at this point, was promoting the idea that the Japanese were the superior race of the world, and that all of the other peoples of East Asia were an inferior race of people. The Japanese military treated the people of Vietnam incredibly brutally, executing huge numbers of innocent civilians. Not surprisingly, there emerged widespread opposition in Vietnam to Japanese rule. Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists now turned their attention to fighting against the Japanese. And this war went on from 1940 to 1945. The United States at this point formed an alliance with Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists, as the United States had formed an alliance with the Soviet Union at this time. The reason that we formed an alliance with the Vietnamese communists was simply that they were fighting Japan, whom we were also fighting by December of 1941. The United States provided weapons and military advisors to assist the Vietnamese communists in their fight against Japan. The United States, of course, defeated Japan in August of 1945, and with the Japanese surrender, Japanese forces were forced to leave to evacuate Vietnam. The big question at this point becomes, what will happen to Vietnam? Ho Chi Minh issues a Declaration of Independence for Vietnam. It's actually interestingly modeled after the US Declaration of Independence. It references inalienable rights and rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the United States now has to decide what its policy will be in Vietnam. Will we recognize Ho Chi Minh and the communists as the government of Vietnam, or oppose them? At this point, the French government, led by Charles de Gaulle, expresses its determination to reclaim its colonies in Indochina. France had been humiliated in the Second World War, and France was determined to reemerge as a world power. And Charles de Gaulle felt that the best way for France to reassert its status as a world power was to reclaim control of its colonial empire, both in North Africa and in Indochina. At the very same time, the Cold War is beginning. The United States is trying to form an alliance to contain the spread of communism, and the United States really needs the support of France in Western Europe as part of this anti-communist alliance. Charles de Gaulle, who was a savvy political leader, at this point made it clear if the United States wanted French support for NATO and for the effort to resist the spread of communism in Europe, the United States would need to support France's efforts to reclaim control of its empire in Indochina. In other parts of the world at this point, the United States was encouraging the liberation of colonies. The United States strongly urged Great Britain to grant independence to its colonial empire, for example, in India, which the British did. The United States also urged the Dutch to grant independence to their colonial empire in Indonesia, which they did. Here, though, the United States faced a particularly difficult diplomatic situation. One problem was the reality that Ho Chi Minh was the leader of a communist movement, and as the Cold War began, the United States was opposed to the spread of communism. The other factor was the reality that the French government was demanding that we support their claim to Indochina in return for their support in the anti-communist alliance in Europe. Ultimately, the United States government, under the leadership of both President Harry Truman and President Dwight Eisenhower, both a Democratic and a Republican president, decided to support the French and to assist the French in their effort to reclaim control of their colonial empire. So, in the late 1940s, the French government sent military forces back into Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The United States did not send any military forces, but the United States did provide massive amounts of weaponry and financial aid to the French war effort. Everyone knew that the United States was supporting France's effort to reclaim control of Vietnam. 80% of all of the weaponry used in the war was coming from the United States. This was not a secret. The French war in Vietnam dragged on from 1945 to 1954. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and Communist China provided weapons and aid to Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists. As you can see, major powers are now involved in this war. Gradually, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists gained control of the northern half of Vietnam, which is more rural and agrarian, whereas the French were able to retain significant control of the southern part of Vietnam, at least the coastal part of which is largely urban. By 1954, the war in Vietnam had become tremendously unpopular in France. It was a very difficult war. French casualties were mounting to a tremendous degree. There were protests against the war in France, and the French suffered a humiliating defeat in 1954 at a battle in the northern part of Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu. Ultimately, in 1954, the French government decided to end its war in Vietnam through negotiating a settlement. In the Geneva Accords, the French agreed to remove all of their forces from Vietnam. Under the terms of the agreement, Vietnam would temporarily be divided into North and South Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists would govern the northern part of Vietnam. The French would establish a Vietnamese government, an independent Vietnamese government in the south. This division was to last for 2 years. In 1956, free elections were to be held across Vietnam to reunite the country, and whoever won the elections would become the government of Vietnam. The French established a Vietnamese government in the south, which was headed by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was Vietnamese, but he was from a family that clearly supported the French. He spoke French, he had been educated in French schools, he was Roman Catholic, and was viewed by many as a puppet of the French government to a great degree. As France withdrew from Vietnam, the United States increasingly became involved directly in South Vietnam, and over time, the United States replaced France as the principal supporter of Ngo Dinh Diem's government in South Vietnam. In 1956, remember, the elections were supposed to occur. But there was a problem. Free elections really could not take place in either the North or South. The North by this point had been transformed into a rather brutal communist dictatorship. The notion that any kind of free election could take place in North Vietnam was really beyond belief at this point. The South also had emerged largely as a dictatorship under Ngo Dinh Diem, and the notion that a free election really could occur in the South was also very improbable. Ngo Dinh Diem declares that he will not hold an election. No election will take place. And this creates a new war. Well, the continuation of the war in Vietnam, really. Now there is a war between North Vietnam, which is ruled by communists, including Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, which is ruled by an anti-communist, Ngo Dinh Diem, who has a strong alliance with the United States. A civil war erupts in South Vietnam. The Vietnamese communists in the north send weapons and support to a communist movement in South Vietnam. A South Vietnamese communist insurgency emerges, known as the Viet Cong, and a civil war rages in South Vietnam. The United States increasingly provides weapons and military advisors to the South Vietnamese government under Ngo Dinh Diem. President John F. Kennedy sends thousands of military advisors into South Vietnam, and the United States actually does begin to engage in small-scale combat in South Vietnam against the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese Communist Force. After John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, Lyndon Johnson becomes president and inherits the conflict in Vietnam. He ultimately will massively escalate the war. Lyndon Johnson, by the end of his presidency, will send 500,000 soldiers into Vietnam to engage in this conflict against the Vietnamese communists. Meanwhile, Communist China and the Soviet Union will increase their support to North Vietnam and the communist forces there. The war in Vietnam really took place from 1921 to 1975. In 1975, the Vietnamese communists ultimately seize control of South Vietnam and reunite the country. So the war lasted more than half a century, even though the United States was not involved in it through the entirety of the conflict. Now, to briefly address the other topics for this week. During the 1960s, there emerged a cultural rebellion. You learned about the culture of the 1950s last week. The culture of the 1950s was somewhat stifling. There are very strict gender norms. There's tremendous pressure to conform to social norms and ideals. And ultimately, there does emerge a cultural reaction against this, a nonconformist movement. It's largely a youth movement, involving young people in their teens and 20s, although some individuals who are somewhat older were involved as well. It was largely a youth movement. It's sometimes referred to as the hippie rebellion. It's often referred to as the Cultural Revolution by historians. This was a rejection of mainstream culture. The hippies rejected materialism, the notion that one's life should be dedicated to requiring material goods, a home in the suburbs, a car, etc. The hippies embraced Eastern religious beliefs, Eastern mysticism, experimented with Buddhism and other faith traditions. Many hippies embraced a different style of clothing, which was very controversial at the time. They rejected, the suits and dresses of mainstream culture. Men grew their hair long. People wore, beads and jeans and bell bottoms. And many of you are probably familiar with the sort of style of the hippie counterculture, which actually has undergone, to some extent, a kind of revival at other periods in our history. The hippies, some of them went off to live in rural communes to commune with nature. Some lived in urban areas like Greenwich Village and Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. The hippies protested against the war in Vietnam oftentimes. The hippies embraced also a vision of racial equality and a greater vision of acceptance of different peoples. The hippie counterculture generally tended to be very accepting of people of different races, different faiths. The hippie counterculture also tended to be very accepting of people with who were gay or lesbian, homosexuals. The hippie counterculture was very tolerant overall in comparison to mainstream American culture, which I think was one of the very positive aspects of the hippie movement. You're going to watch a film called The Summer of Love. In 1967, hippies in a neighborhood called Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco announced that there would be a summer of love in the Haight, and invited hippies from across the country to move to San Francisco. Ultimately, over 100,000 young people moved to San Francisco in the summer of 1967. This included people who were very young. There were many teens, 13, 14, 15 years old, who ran away from home and moved to San Francisco. So what you had was over 100,000 people living in the streets of San Francisco, living in the parks and the streets, and in buildings, of course, as well. And there was a significant amount of drug use, which was an aspect of the hippie counterculture, marijuana, as well as drugs like LSD. A group called the Diggers would try to gather food to feed the hippie population of Haight-Ashbury, and there would be a free distribution of food. A musical culture developed. The Grateful Dead were part of this, and free public concerts were put on. Free stores developed where you could come in and take anything you wanted and leave anything that you wanted in exchange. There was an idea of rejecting materialism and forming a new perfect community, not rooted in money and in materialism, basically. Ultimately, drugs were very devastating to the community. Crime emerged as well, as some sought to exploit this population. And you'll watch a film related to this, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts about it. Finally, you'll be reading about shifts in immigration law. In 1924, the United States Congress passed the National Origins Act, which greatly restricted immigration. It barred immigration from large parts of Asia and greatly limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe as well. Most scholars today believe that the Immigration Act of 1924, the National Origins Act, was extremely discriminatory and rooted in racism. It created national quotas. A certain number of people would be admitted to the United States from each country. In 1965, the National Origins Act was repealed. Bless me. I'm sorry. Excuse me. The National Origins Act was repealed and replaced with a new Immigration Act. The Immigration Act of 1965 replaced the national quotas. No longer would there be national quotas. Instead, immigration would now be based on family relationship and needed job skills. So the new immigration law emphasized family reunification. In other words, priority would be given to immigrants who already had family members living in the United States. Secondly, priority would be given to individuals who had job skills that were in demand in the United States. And this is basically the immigration system that we still have in place today. And it led to a massive shift in the nature of immigration. Immigrants from parts of the world that had previously been prohibited now entered the United States. There emerged a large influx of immigrants from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, which made the United States even more diverse and enriched the cultural heritage of the United States. So I hope that you'll find that article interesting as well. Again, I look forward to working with you this week. Thank you for your time.